A new beginning. Danny had spent most of his life chasing down wrongs, bringing order to chaos. At 54, he had seen every kind of criminal, from petty thieves to the most dangerous of drug cartels. His reputation stretched from the rough neighborhoods of New York City to the mountain valleys of Tennessee. He'd been a cop long enough to know that the job wasn't about personal glory or accolades. It was about ensuring justice and keeping the peace, even when the world around you seemed intent on doing the opposite. After his last job in a crime-ridden city, Danny had decided it was time to step away from the intense pressure, the constant threats, and the unending chaos. So, when the opportunity came to move to a quiet little town in South Carolina, a place he could finally breathe, he jumped at it. Drake's Hollow was small, almost too small to matter in the grand scheme of things. But Danny knew that this was where he could make the kind of difference that mattered most, the kind that would last. His first impression of Drake's Hollow wasn't what he'd expected. As his car rumbled down the single winding road leading into the town, he felt as if the place was frozen in time. The streets were lined with small, one-story houses, and the occasional elderly couple stood out front, rocking in chairs, eyes glued to the slow-paced world around them. The trees were thick, the air smelled of rich pine and damp earth, and the horizon was a mix of green fields and the outline of distant mountains. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. But Danny knew better than to trust appearances. There was always something beneath the surface, something hidden waiting to break free, and he had learned the hard way that the true nature of a place revealed itself when you least expected it. When he pulled into the parking lot of the town's police station, he noticed the silence. There were no patrol cars lined up, no officers standing at attention, and no hustle or bustle. It was almost as if the building was abandoned. Danny's instincts kicked in. As he stepped out of his car, a few locals watched him from a distance, their eyes following him as though he were a curiosity, but no one approached. He could feel the unspoken tension in the air. The town wasn't exactly thrilled about a new face, especially not one with a title. He was the outsider, and they were going to make sure he knew it. Taking a deep breath, Danny made his way toward the front door of the station. As soon as he entered, a sense of déjà vu washed over him. The building looked like any other police station in a small town, old wooden desks, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the faint smell of stale coffee in the air. But there was something about the place that felt off. Maybe it was the way the officers sat in silence, watching him from behind their desks, or the way their eyes narrowed when they saw him walk through the door. They didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge his presence, as if he had just walked into a room full of strangers, people who had no reason to care about his arrival. But Danny wasn't a man to waste time on pleasantries. He cleared his throat and introduced himself. "I'm Chief Danny Sullivan," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've just moved here, and I'll be taking over the department." The officers exchanged glances, some nodding with a forced politeness, others just staring at him, their expressions unreadable. No one spoke. A young officer named Carter, with a fresh uniform and a nervous energy, stood up first. He seemed eager to make an impression, and Danny could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead as he approached. "Welcome, Chief," Carter said, a little too enthusiastically. "We're glad to have you here. I'm Officer Carter." Danny shook his hand firmly, his grip strong, his eyes scanning the room. He was getting a sense of the dynamic here. Most of these officers were quiet, maybe a little too quiet. The energy in the room felt cold, reserved. It was as though no one was quite ready to accept him, not yet. "Thanks, Carter. I'll need a tour of the station, see how everything is set up," Danny said, trying to break the ice. Carter nodded, leading him around the small building. They passed by old filing cabinets, a few dusty trophies from long-forgotten community events, and bulletin boards filled with half-hearted reminders about safety and local events. As they reached the back, Danny noticed a locked door. "What's behind that?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Oh, that's the evidence room," Carter replied quickly. It's nothing special. Just evidence we've collected over the years. Some of it hasn't been touched in years. Danny made a mental note of that. He was starting to understand something about the department. It was stagnant. There was no urgency, no drive to keep things in check. The officers didn't seem particularly interested in the finer details of the law, and the entire department felt like it was stuck in time. After the brief tour, Danny asked Carter to gather the rest of the officers for a meeting. As they sat in the cramped conference room, Danny looked at the faces of the men and women who would soon be under his command. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken skepticism that hung in the air. It was clear they were waiting for him to say something, but Danny wasn't one to give empty speeches. Instead, he decided to speak the truth, the only way he knew how. "I'm here because I believe in doing things the right way," Danny began. "You may not know me, but you'll get to know me soon enough. I don't care about your old ways, your little games, or your old traditions. I'm here to get this department back on track. There's a reason I was called here to Drake's Hollow, and it wasn't to play nice. I've been in this game long enough to know that it takes more than a badge to earn respect, it takes action." The officers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others whispering among themselves. But Danny stood firm, letting his words sink in. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to turn things around, and if they didn't like it, they could leave. But Danny knew something the officers didn't. He had dealt with tougher situations before. He had walked into departments where corruption ran deep, where officers took bribes and ignored crimes, where trust was non-existent. But he had fixed them, one step at a time, and this was no different. He left the meeting feeling as though he had said what needed to be said, but the battle was far from over. He could feel the eyes of the officers still on him, but this was only the beginning. What they didn't realize was that Danny was no ordinary chief, and he wasn't here to make the same mistakes as the men who had come before him. The town may have felt like a quiet little bubble, but Danny knew better. There was a storm brewing underneath, and it wouldn't take long for it to break. He just hoped that when it did, he was ready. As he left the station that evening, the setting sun casting a golden hue over the streets of Drake's Hollow, he felt the weight of his decision settle deeper into his bones. Tomorrow would be his first full day on the job, and he would need to tread carefully. But no matter what came next, Danny Sullivan wasn't going to back down. Not from these officers, not from the town, and certainly not from anyone who thought they could control him. Drake's Hollow may have been a small town, but its secrets ran deep. And Danny was about to uncover them all. The warm welcome. The next morning, Danny woke up early, as he had done for most of his life. His body clock was precise, as if conditioned by years of rising before dawn to tackle the day head-on. He had already unpacked most of his belongings the night before, a few personal items, some old photographs, and a few books from his years of service. His office, though modest, felt like the calm before a storm. As he stepped outside, the town had a different vibe in the morning light. The quiet streets were bathed in a soft orange glow, the air heavy with the promise of another hot day. The trees, their leaves shifting in the wind, seemed to watch over the town like ancient sentinels. Drake's Hollow had the kind of beauty that could put anyone at ease. But Danny wasn't here for the view. He was here to change things. Walking to his car, he noticed a few residents milling about, greeting each other with friendly smiles and slow nods. They all knew each other, and he knew they were curious about the new chief. There had been murmurs in the town about the strange outsider who had taken over the department, whispers at the local cafe, and cautious stares from the older generation. His footsteps echoed through the still morning air as he made his way to the police station. He noticed that the place was quieter than usual, as if the officers were holding their breath, waiting for him to make his next move. Danny had made a decision the night before. He wasn't going to tiptoe around these officers. His goal wasn't to be liked, it was to earn their respect. The problem, however, was that respect wasn't something these officers were handing out easily. He could feel their skepticism from the moment he had walked into that meeting the day before. But Danny had been through tougher situations. He'd dealt with officers who thought their way was the only way, and he had won them over. As he approached the door to the station, he was met by Carter again, the young officer who had tried to make a good impression the day before. "Morning, Chief," Carter said, his voice a little less enthusiastic than the day before. "Ready to start the day?" "Morning," Danny replied. He took a moment to study the young officer's face. There was something about Carter that reminded him of himself when he was just starting out, young, eager, maybe too eager. He hadn't been through the fire yet, and it showed. "Let's get started," Danny said, his tone firm but not unkind. Carter led him into the station, where a few officers were already gathered. The atmosphere inside was still tense, the air heavy with expectation. As Danny walked into the main room, a few officers looked up, but most of them didn't bother to stand. Some had their heads down, pretending to be busy, while others exchanged glances. But there was one officer in particular who caught Danny's attention, Detective Walker. He was an older man, in his late 40s, with a permanent scowl on his face. His reputation preceded him. Danny had heard rumors about Walker, and none of them were good. Walker was a man who liked to operate on his own terms, a man who didn't take kindly to newcomers. Danny had a feeling that Walker would be his biggest challenge. "Good morning, Detective," Danny said, walking up to him. His voice was calm but carried an edge of authority. Walker didn't stand up. He didn't even look Danny in the eye. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest as if to signal that he wasn't impressed. "Morning," Walker muttered, his voice low. Danny took a breath and pushed on. "I'm not here to play games. I came to get things done, and I need all of you to get on board with that." The other officers in the room exchanged looks but said nothing. Danny knew that some of them were probably hoping he'd fail. It was a small town, and things had been done a certain way for a long time. Change wasn't always welcome, especially when it came from an outsider. Carter stepped forward again, his eyes wide. "Chief, we were thinking about heading out for some patrols today. Just a routine check, nothing too serious." Danny nodded. "Good. Let's go." There was a long pause before the officers moved. They didn't seem eager to follow him, but they complied. As they headed out the door, Danny noticed that the town, despite its quiet nature, seemed almost too still. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The patrol was uneventful at first, just the usual checks and rounds. Danny observed his officers closely. They weren't particularly sharp, nor did they seem to care much about making a positive impression. Some of them were chatting, others were on their phones, and a few just seemed to be going through the motions. It wasn't what Danny had expected. He had thought he would be stepping into a tight-knit team, one that had each other's backs. Instead, he was faced with a group of people who seemed more interested in keeping the peace in their own way, not the way he envisioned. As they made their way down Main Street, something caught Danny's eye. Two younger officers, Walker and Rogers, were standing by the corner, laughing as they shared some kind of inside joke. Danny's instincts flared. He could feel the subtle hostility radiating from their posture. They had no interest in treating him as an equal, no desire to work as a team. They saw him as a target, a man to be pushed around. He turned to Carter, who was standing by his side. "Who's in charge of those two?" Well, technically, Detective Walker is," Carter said, glancing over at the two officers. "But, Rogers tends to follow Walker's lead." Danny nodded, his mind already working. He could see the seeds of trouble being planted. These two weren't just rebellious, they were actively undermining him, testing his limits. They had already seen him as an outsider and were eager to remind him of it. I'll handle it, Danny said firmly. You stay back. Danny walked up to Walker and Rogers, his steps deliberate, each one a symbol of authority. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't going to let this slide. Walker, Rogers, he said as he approached. The two officers straightened up immediately, but there was a trace of mockery in their eyes. They had been expecting a confrontation, but they didn't seem worried. I don't know what you think this is, Danny began, his tone calm but unwavering. But I didn't come here to be some kind of joke. I'm the chief, and if you think you can disrespect me or undermine my authority, you're going to be very disappointed. There was a long pause. Walker looked at Rogers, who gave him a slight nod, as if encouraging him to push back. Walker's lips curled into a smirk. We're just having a little fun, Chief, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You know, getting to know you. Danny's eyes narrowed. I didn't come here for a game. I came here to lead. And I don't take kindly to people who try to make me the punchline of theirs. Walker's smirk faltered, but Rogers stepped in, trying to deflect the tension. We're just kidding, Chief. No harm meant. Danny didn't back down. That's not how this works. You think you can bully me? I've been around the block more times than you've been alive. You'll show respect, or you'll find yourself working somewhere else. For a brief moment, neither officer spoke. But there was something in Danny's words, something that made them hesitate. It wasn't just the authority in his voice. It was the unspoken promise that he wasn't going to let things slide. You got it, Chief, Walker finally said, his tone flat. Danny nodded. Good. Let's keep it that way. As he walked away, he knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time since arriving in Drake's Hollow, he felt like he was starting to make a dent. The power had shifted, if only slightly. These officers hadn't expected him to stand up for himself, and now they knew that when Danny Sullivan said something, he meant it. And just like that, the warm welcome he had expected to come with a handshake had instead come with a challenge. But Danny was prepared. After all, this was only the beginning. The show begins. The next few days felt like a whirlwind, though not for the reasons Danny had expected. Drake's Hollow was supposed to be a small, quiet town, an idyllic place for someone to retire from the chaos of larger cities. But from the moment he'd stepped into his role as chief, it was clear that this was not going to be the peaceful change of pace he had hoped for. His early interactions with the officers had been tense, but manageable. There was resistance, yes, but Danny wasn't new to pushing back. His reputation as someone who would hold the line, no matter the cost, had preceded him. However, nothing had prepared him for what was coming next. It was late one evening, about a week after his first patrol, when he found himself sitting at his desk, going through a stack of paperwork. The moonlight filtered through the blinds of his office, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the town seemed unusually quiet, almost too quiet for his liking. He hadn't yet gained the full trust of the department, but he was determined to get there. And despite the tension that lingered in the air, Danny knew one thing: he couldn't let these officers think he was weak. Just as he was about to finish for the day, there was a knock on his office door. It was Carter, looking sheepish as he stepped inside. "Chief, there's something you need to see," Carter said, his voice hesitant. Danny raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" I don't know if I should be telling you this, but there's a group of the guys, Officers Walker and Rogers included, they're planning something tonight. I heard them talking about it." Danny leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Something like what?" "I'm not sure, Chief," Carter continued, wringing his hands nervously. "But it sounded like they were planning some kind of prank. They've been acting strange, and I've never seen them like this before. I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should know." Danny could feel the shift in the air. It was more than just a prank, it felt like a challenge, a test of his authority. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had expected. These officers were going to try to break him, to see if he had what it took to lead. He didn't hesitate. "Show me." As they drove toward the town square, Danny's mind raced. The officers who had been mocking him behind closed doors were about to make their move in front of the entire town. It wasn't just a personal affront, it was an attack on his leadership. He had to deal with this swiftly, and he had to do it in a way that made a statement. When they reached the square, Danny saw them, Walker, Rogers, and a couple of other officers, all gathered around a lamp post. There was a palpable energy to the group, and it felt off. They had no idea that he was watching from the shadows, but Danny could hear their laughter echoing in the otherwise empty square. "You ready to give him a proper welcome?" Rogers asked, his voice filled with childish excitement. "I think he needs to know his place," Walker replied with a smirk. "Maybe this will teach him that we run things here." Danny clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what was happening. These officers were about to tie him to the very same lamp post where they had humiliated him just a few days earlier. But this time, it wouldn't be a harmless joke, it was an attempt to break him in front of the townsfolk. The officers didn't notice him approaching. Danny moved swiftly, but quietly, until he was close enough to hear every word. "You really think this will work?" Rogers asked, a mockingly cheerful tone in his voice. "You think he'll just roll over?" Walker shrugged. "It's worth a shot. If he's going to lead us, he needs to learn who's in charge." Danny's eyes narrowed. He couldn't let this stand. Not now, not ever. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. The officers froze, their faces paling as they turned to face him. "Enough," Danny said, his voice calm but dripping with authority. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His words alone carried the weight of his experience. Walker's face twisted in surprise, but he quickly recovered, his bravado returning. "Oh, look who decided to show up," he said, trying to mask his nervousness with sarcasm. "Thought you could sneak up on us, Chief?" Danny didn't flinch. "This ends now. I'm not here to be a joke, and neither are you." Rogers, the younger officer, sneered. "And what are you going to do about it, Chief? You think you can just tell us what to do?" "Yes, I do," Danny replied, his eyes hardening. "You can either untie that rope, or I'll have you both in front of a judge tomorrow morning. Your choice." The tension was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. Walker and Rogers exchanged a brief glance, each of them sizing up the situation. Danny could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. They had tested him before, but this was different. This wasn't a prank. It was an act of defiance. And Danny wasn't about to let them get away with it. Finally, it was Walker who spoke. "You think you can just come in here and start telling us what to do?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You think just because you wear that badge, we're going to follow your orders?" Danny took a step forward, his presence now filling the space between them. "I don't need you to follow me because of a badge. I need you to follow me because you respect the law, because you respect this town, and because you respect your job. You either get on board with that, or you can find another line of work." For a long moment, Walker and Rogers stood there, unwilling to look him in the eye. They had pushed him to his limit, but Danny had remained calm, unwavering. Finally, Rogers let out a frustrated sigh and tossed the rope aside. "Fine," he muttered, turning away. "You're the boss, Chief." Walker glared at Danny, but he knew better than to escalate things further. He tossed the rope onto the ground, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Good choice," Danny said coolly, his voice calm but laced with an underlying strength. "Now get back to work. And don't think for a second that I won't hold you accountable for this." As Danny watched the officers slowly retreat, he felt a small sense of victory. It hadn't been easy, but he had stood his ground. This wasn't just about power, it was about earning respect, showing these officers that their old ways wouldn't fly under his watch. The next day, the town square was as quiet as ever, but something had shifted. The officers were different, more subdued, less cocky. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Danny had made it clear that this town, and his department, would be run with professionalism and integrity. And while the officers may have thought they had humiliated him, Danny had turned the tables. In the end, it was they who had been exposed, and it was he who had emerged victorious. The real test, however, was yet to come. He could feel the undercurrents of unrest still rippling through the department, and Danny knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But one thing was certain, he wasn't about to back down. He was here to stay, and he was going to make sure this town learned that respect wasn't something you could just demand. It was something you had to earn. And Danny Sullivan was just getting started. The turning point. The days following the confrontation in the town square were tense, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Danny had proven, in no uncertain terms, that he would not back down in the face of disrespect. The officers who had once looked at him with sneers now regarded him with wariness, if not a bit of respect. Danny knew this was just the beginning. He had earned a small victory, but the real battle, one for the soul of the department, was still ahead. The town of Drake's Hollow had been quiet for as long as anyone could remember, but Danny had seen enough to know that something was lurking beneath the surface. There was more at play here than lazy officers or petty rebellion. The real issue was deeper, a culture of complacency that had been allowed to fester for years, a network of influence that Danny hadn't fully grasped yet, and a town that wasn't ready for the kind of change he was planning to bring. It wasn't long before Danny began to notice the cracks in the veneer of this perfect little town. The officers, despite their outward compliance, still weren't buying into his leadership. It wasn't obvious at first, most of them went through the motions, doing what was required without much enthusiasm. But there were whispers. Subtle, almost imperceptible hints that things weren't as simple as they seemed. One morning, as Danny walked into the station, he found a small group of officers gathered in the break room. They were talking quietly, too quietly. He didn't need to hear the specifics to know they were discussing him. As soon as he walked through the door, the conversation stopped, and they looked up at him with that familiar mix of suspicion and distaste. "Morning, Chief," Officer Carter said, a little too brightly, clearly trying to mask the tension in the room. But Danny could see it. He could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing the status quo, the fear of being forced to change. "Morning," Danny replied coolly, scanning the room. "What's going on in here? I thought we had patrols to organize." "Nothing important, Chief," Walker said from the back of the room. His voice was too casual, his eyes avoiding Danny's gaze. "Just the usual, checking in, you know." Danny didn't buy it for a second. He had seen enough to know when something was being swept under the rug. "Right," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Well, I suggest we get back to work. We've got a department to run." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but they all stood up and slowly filed out of the room. Danny's instincts were screaming at him. Something was going on, something he wasn't seeing. He'd need to dig deeper. The breakthrough came a few days later, when Danny received an anonymous tip. It was a letter, hand-delivered to his office late at night, just after everyone else had gone home. The letter was short, to the point, and filled with cryptic warnings. The handwriting was rushed, shaky. "The corruption runs deep. They've been doing this for years. It's not just the officers, there are people in this town who protect them. Watch your back." Danny's pulse quickened as he read the words again, this time with more scrutiny. He'd suspected as much. There had been rumors about the department, rumors about officers looking the other way, about deals made in the shadows, and about a network of influence that reached beyond the police force. This letter confirmed it, but it also left him with more questions than answers. Who had sent it? Who could he trust? And, more importantly, who was behind the corruption? The very next day, Danny called an emergency meeting with the department's top officers. He had a feeling he was about to uncover something that would rock Drake's Hollow to its core. He needed to prepare himself, and his officers, for what was coming. As they gathered around the table, Danny wasted no time getting to the point. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Someone's been keeping secrets. And it's not just one or two bad apples, it's a rot that's deep within this department." The officers stared back at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and skepticism. It wasn't just the younger officers like Carter who were concerned, even Detective Walker, who had been one of the most vocal of Danny's critics, seemed uneasy. "Chief," Walker said slowly, as if testing Danny's resolve, "what exactly are you talking about? We're doing things by the book now. We're on the right track." Danny didn't flinch. "I've been here long enough to know that things aren't as neat and tidy as they seem. We've been covering up for too long, and I'm done pretending we can just ignore it." The room grew heavy with tension. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What are you saying, Chief?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny's eyes locked onto Carter's. "I'm saying there's more going on here than just bad habits. I've received information that suggests some of you have been looking the other way when it comes to certain things. Things that go against everything this department stands for." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some of the officers shifted in their seats, others avoided Danny's gaze. He could feel the walls closing in, but he wasn't backing down. He had to know who was involved, and how far it went. "What kind of things?" Walker asked, his tone tinged with suspicion. "Are you accusing us of something, Chief?" Danny kept his voice even. "I'm accusing the department of being complicit in covering up crimes. Not all of you, but enough of you to create a pattern. Drugs, stolen property, and even protection for criminals who pay to keep their freedom. I don't know the extent yet, but I will find out." Walker's face twisted with anger, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "That's a serious accusation. You better have proof before you start throwing around those kinds of words." Danny didn't flinch. "I don't need proof right now. I've got something better. This town's been covering for you, protecting you, because they don't want the truth to come out. But I'm not afraid of the truth. And I'm not afraid of what it will cost to clean this up." The room was silent for a long moment. Danny's words hung heavy in the air, like the calm before a storm. Then, slowly, Carter spoke up. "What do you want us to do, Chief?" Danny stood tall. "I want you to stop hiding behind your badge. I want you to stop covering for the ones who are making this town sick. We are here to serve and protect, not to feed into the system that exploits the people who need us most." There was a beat of silence. Finally, Carter nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "We're with you, Chief." Danny turned to the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping across each officer's face. "Good. Because this isn't just about fixing the department, it's about saving this town from itself." In the following days, Danny began to dig deeper into the corruption he suspected had run through the town for years. He met with local informants, reviewed old case files, and began to piece together the web of influence that had allowed certain officers, and certain members of the community, to operate above the law. What he uncovered was nothing short of shocking. There were several high-ranking officers who had been involved in shady dealings with local criminals, and the department had been turning a blind eye for years. But Danny wasn't just going to stand by and let the system continue to rot from the inside out. He was determined to make it right, no matter the cost. And as the days went on, he could feel the weight of the battle ahead. The truth was ugly, and there would be no way to move forward without tearing apart the very foundation the town had been built on. But Danny had no illusions. This wasn't about saving face or sparing feelings. It was about doing the right thing, no matter how painful it was. In the end, Danny knew this was just the beginning. He had already made enemies, and the real fight was yet to come. But as long as he had the support of the people who truly believed in justice, those who hadn't been corrupted by the system, he knew he could win. He wasn't just the chief of police anymore. He was a man on a mission to cleanse his department and his town. And he wasn't going to stop until the job was done. The reckoning. The days following Danny's revelation to the department were nothing short of a calculated siege. The facade that had held Drake's Hollow together for so many years was beginning to crack, and there was no going back. The officers who had once been complacent, those who had turned a blind eye to the corruption around them, were starting to feel the heat. And Danny wasn't about to let up. After the emergency meeting in the station, Danny had taken the first step toward rooting out the rot. He'd called in the town's most trusted individuals, including a few former officers who had left the force under questionable circumstances but had valuable insights. Danny knew that if he was going to win this battle, he needed to gather intel from every angle. He wasn't going to give anyone an opportunity to slip through the cracks. But the clock was ticking. With every day, the situation was becoming more volatile. As Danny walked through the quiet streets of Drake's Hollow, he could feel the weight of what he was about to do. There was no turning back now. The people who had been complicit in the system weren't going to go down easily. But Danny had always been a man who faced challenges head-on, no matter the consequences. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Danny sat in his office, sifting through more files, evidence from years of backdoor deals and corrupted cases. His phone buzzed, an unexpected call from Sheriff Henderson, his old friend from the neighboring county. Henderson had been keeping tabs on the situation from a distance, but Danny knew that now was the time to bring in outside help. "Danny, I've got your back," the sheriff said, his voice serious. "I've been watching how things are unfolding, and I know it's going to get ugly. But we'll help you clean house, one way or another. But you've got to be ready for what's coming. These people don't take kindly to someone digging up their skeletons." Danny paused for a moment, thinking of the people involved in this tangled mess. "I'm ready, Sheriff. We can't let this go on any longer. The corruption runs too deep, and it's time the town sees the truth." Henderson's voice softened slightly. "All right, we'll coordinate with the feds. If it comes down to it, we can make this as big as it needs to be. Just don't forget who's with you." Danny hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The sheriff was right, this wasn't going to be an easy fight, and it was going to require more than just a few arrests. It was going to take a complete overhaul of the town's law enforcement and its connections to the criminal underworld. The next morning, Danny called a meeting with his most trusted officers, Carter, who had started to show real promise, and a few others who had been cautiously supportive since the night at the town square. They gathered in the conference room, and Danny could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about his leadership anymore, it was about the very soul of Drake's Hollow. "I've got a plan," Danny began, his voice low but firm. "We start by hitting the people who have been at the center of this, the ones who have been pulling the strings. We take out the head of the snake, and the rest will follow. But it's not going to be easy. We're going to need backup, and we're going to need to move fast." Carter leaned forward, his face serious. "What's the first step, Chief?" Danny slid a folder across the table. "We've got a list of the officers involved. I've already gathered enough to make arrests. The next step is to hit them where it hurts, their connections. We need to bring in the people who've been protecting them from the outside. Once we have that, we'll have everything we need to bring down the whole network. Are you sure we're ready for this?" Carter asked, his voice filled with concern. What if we move too quickly? What if they go into hiding before we can act? Danny's gaze hardened. We don't have the luxury of waiting. This town has been rotting from the inside for too long. We're going to strike tonight. This will be the first step in taking back control. The plan was set into motion with military precision. Danny had spent days planning the operation, coordinating with the sheriff, the feds, and a handful of trusted local informants who had been willing to risk everything to bring justice to Drake's Hollow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the operation began. Danny's officers, alongside the sheriff's deputies, moved swiftly and silently, setting up roadblocks around the town and making sure that no one would be able to slip through their grasp. The element of surprise was crucial, and Danny knew that the officers they were targeting would never see it coming. Danny and Carter led the first raid on a local property, one that had long been suspected of being a front for criminal activity. The man who ran the operation, a low-level thug named Bobby Jansen, was known for his connections to both the local law enforcement and outside criminal syndicates. Jansen's house, nestled on the outskirts of town, was the perfect place to start. As Danny and his team approached, Carter's voice came through the radio, "We've got eyes on Jansen. He's home, and we're moving in." The quiet hum of radios and the shuffling of boots on gravel filled the air as Danny and his team moved into position. There was no turning back now. The sound of the front door being kicked open echoed through the otherwise silent night. "Clear!" Danny shouted into his radio as they stormed through the house. "Search everything. We need everything he's been hiding." As they moved through the house, Danny's gut told him they were about to find something big. And it didn't take long. In the back room of the house, hidden behind a false wall, they found a stash of drugs, illegal firearms, and stacks of cash, all marked with the distinct insignia of various local crime organizations. But there was something else, an encrypted file on a hidden laptop, containing names, addresses, and dates. The information was explosive. It connected several high-ranking officials in the town to criminal enterprises from outside the region. Danny's heart raced as he looked at the evidence. This was it, the break he needed. But the mission wasn't over yet. As they loaded the evidence into the truck, Danny could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The rest of the town would soon know what was happening. By the time the sun began to rise, the streets of Drake's Hollow were crawling with activity. The raids were in full swing, and Danny's officers were rounding up suspects left and right. What started as a few key arrests had quickly turned into a town-wide operation, one that would dismantle the criminal network piece by piece. Danny stood in the middle of the action, directing his officers with precision. He was moving faster than he ever had before, driven by a sense of urgency that felt almost like a fire burning inside him. As the first of the corrupt officers were arrested and led away in handcuffs, Danny could feel the eyes of the town on him. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had suffered in silence, everyone who had been powerless to stop the corruption that had taken root in their community. As the day wore on and more arrests were made, Danny's mind raced. He knew that this was just the beginning. There was still more to uncover, more to clean up, and more lives to be changed. But for the first time since he had arrived in Drake's Hollow, he felt the weight of the town shift. People were starting to take notice. They were seeing the truth that had been hidden for so long, and they were beginning to believe that real change was possible. But there was one more thing Danny had to do. He needed to face the person who had been pulling the strings all along, the one who had orchestrated the entire system of corruption from behind the scenes. And Danny knew exactly who that person was. It was time for the final confrontation. The new era. The morning after the raids had ended, Drake's Hollow was a town transformed. What had once been a peaceful, seemingly idyllic place was now a site of upheaval and rebirth. The sting of the truth was fresh, but there was no denying it, the system had been shattered. The corruption that had hidden behind a veil of tradition, respect, and local loyalty was now exposed for all to see. And while the immediate aftermath had left the community in shock, the long-term implications were even more profound. This was the beginning of a new era for Drake's Hollow, one that would be shaped by the strength and determination of its people, and the resolve of its new chief. Danny had known the aftermath of such revelations would be chaotic. As the news spread like wildfire, the media arrived in full force, eager to report on the story of a town's battle with its own corruption. Local businesses buzzed with the conversations of stunned townsfolk, many of them in disbelief over the revelations. The faces of longtime residents, some who had never known anything but the familiar rhythms of life in Drake's Hollow, were filled with confusion, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. But there was one thing that became clear very quickly: the town needed leadership. And as much as Danny knew the storm was far from over, he felt a sense of pride. The fight had been long, and it wasn't over yet, but this town, his town now, was waking up. The first few days after the arrests were filled with press conferences, legal proceedings, and community meetings. Every time Danny stepped into the public eye, the weight of the town's eyes on him was overwhelming. People were searching for answers, looking for someone to explain how things had gone so wrong, how those they had trusted had betrayed them. At one of the town hall meetings, a mother of two approached him, her eyes still red from crying. "Chief Sullivan, how could this happen? How could we not know what was going on in our own town?" Danny met her gaze, his voice steady but filled with empathy. "I know it's hard to believe. I know it feels like the world you thought you knew has been turned upside down. But the reality is, we were all blind to the signs. Those in power, who were meant to protect us, used that power to hurt the very people they swore to serve. But today, we begin to rebuild. Today, we begin to take back our town." Her expression softened slightly, though the hurt didn't disappear. "And what about those who helped them? The ones who just stood by and did nothing?" Danny took a deep breath. "We will hold everyone accountable. Everyone who chose to stay silent, who chose to be complicit, will face justice. But we will also make sure that what comes next is about healing, about creating a system that is built on trust and transparency. No more secrets. No more lies." The mother nodded, though her face was still clouded with doubt. But as Danny looked around the room, he saw the flickers of hope in the eyes of others. They were ready for change. It wasn't going to be easy. It would take time. But for the first time, they had someone who would fight for them. While the town was reeling from the shock, Danny knew that the hardest battles were still ahead. The arrests had taken down the visible culprits, the officers who had been complicit, the local criminals who had worked with them, and the network of corruption that had run beneath the surface. But the system of control, the ones who had allowed this to happen for so long, was still intact. There was one more person to confront. The one who had been the puppet master. Danny's instincts had told him early on that someone higher up was pulling the strings, someone who had been behind the scenes orchestrating the entire operation. It had taken time, but Danny had finally pieced together the truth. The real architect of the corruption in Drake's Hollow wasn't just some low-level criminal, it was the town's very own mayor, Tom Reynolds. Reynolds had been a fixture of the community for years, a man who had cultivated an image of respectability, a man of the people, who spoke in smooth tones and always had a kind word for everyone. But beneath the polished exterior, he had been the one pulling the strings, securing deals with organized crime, and ensuring that the law enforcement officers turned a blind eye to the illegal activities that were thriving under his nose. Danny had seen enough. It was time to confront Reynolds, to face the man who had been the true force behind the corruption that had plagued the town. But even with all the evidence against him, Danny knew that bringing down a figure as powerful as the mayor wasn't going to be easy. He would have to act carefully, make sure that the people were behind him, and that Reynolds had no escape. It wasn't long before Danny's moment came. A meeting was called, ostensibly a town gathering to address the ongoing changes in the department and to provide a sense of direction for the community. The mayor, ever the figurehead, was scheduled to speak. But this time, Danny had different plans. He knew Reynolds would use the meeting to spin the narrative in his favor, to play the victim and cast blame elsewhere. Danny had no intention of letting him do that. When the meeting began, the room was filled with an air of anticipation. People were sitting on edge, unsure of what would come next. And when Reynolds stepped up to the podium, his practiced smile never faltered, though his eyes flickered with something darker as he scanned the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice smooth and measured, "I stand before you today as a man who has always tried to do right by this town. Yes, there have been challenges, yes, mistakes were made, but I am committed to ensuring we move forward together, stronger than ever." Danny was already standing, his presence cutting through the noise like a sharp knife. "No more lies, Mayor Reynolds," Danny said, his voice booming across the room. "You don't get to stand here and pretend like you had no part in this. You're the reason this town has been broken. You're the reason that the officers turned a blind eye to corruption. And you're the reason so many people in this room are now victims of your deceit." The room went silent. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to unfold. Reynolds' face went pale, his expression faltering for the first time. "What are you talking about, Danny? I've done more for this town than you could ever imagine." Danny stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "You've done enough, all right. You've ensured that your criminal friends were never held accountable. You've sold this town out to make deals behind closed doors. And you're going to pay for it." With a single motion, Danny handed over a stack of documents to the media, each page filled with damning evidence that tied Reynolds to the very crimes the town had suffered under for so long. There were financial records, wiretap transcripts, and confidential documents showing Reynolds' direct involvement in criminal enterprises. The truth was now inescapable. Reynolds' eyes darted around the room, his calm demeanor cracking as the reality of his situation sank in. "You can't do this," he spat, his voice shaking. "I'll make sure you regret this." Danny looked him square in the eyes. "I've already made sure the people of Drake's Hollow will never forget the truth. You're done." The fallout from Reynolds' arrest was swift. The town of Drake's Hollow, for all its pain and uncertainty, was beginning to heal. With Reynolds in custody, the criminal network he had built began to unravel, and those who had helped prop him up were exposed for what they were. Danny had done it. He had brought justice to a town that had long been ruled by lies. But the road ahead was still long. There was much work to be done to rebuild the trust of the people, to restore faith in the department, and to ensure that no one ever took advantage of the system again. But Danny was ready. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and now, as the sun rose over Drake's Hollow for the first time in years, he knew the future was finally in their hands. The new era had begun. And Danny Sullivan, the chief who had never backed down, would lead them into it, stronger, more united, and ready to face whatever challenges came next.